If tier cakes terrify you, this tutorial will change that. I'll show you exactly how to stack and decorate a tiered cake so it stays straight, stable, and stress-free to transport. First, choose the size of your cake. Make sure each cake is at least 2 inches smaller than the tier underneath so that you can clearly see each layer once they're stacked. I'm using 8-inch, 6-inch, and 4-inch cakes. For your base, use a thick, sturdy cake board, ideally a cake drum. It should be about 4 inches wider than your bottom tier, which gives you space for decorations around the cake, and also somewhere to hold on when you lift or move it. You'll also need cake boards for the upper tiers, and these should be exactly the same size as the cakes they'll support. I'll call these invisible cake boards because they'll be completely hidden underneath the cakes later. Cardboard cake boards are strong enough to support the weight of cakes, but they're also easy to cut down to size if you need to trim them. They should have a grease-proof lining so they don't absorb moisture from the cake. For this tiny 4-inch cake, I don't have a matching board, so I'm making one by tracing around the pan onto a larger cake board and cutting it out. For each cake, spread a bit of buttercream onto the cake board and press your first cake layer onto it to attach it securely. For the bottom tier, assemble the cake directly on your cake drum. Spread on your filling, I'm using buttercream, and continue layering your cake. As you stack each layer, make sure it's directly on top of the layer underneath so that the cake stays straight, instead of leaning to one side. For the upper tiers, assemble those on the invisible cake boards that are exactly the same size as each cake. Attach the first cake layer with a bit of buttercream to act like glue, holding it in place while you build the cake. These invisible cake boards are really important because they'll support the weight of each cake once you've created your supports. Without these boards, the top tiers would sink down into the bottom cake. Continue layering your cakes and fillings, and if any filling bulges out around the sides, flatten it with your offset spatula or angled palette knife. That will make frosting the cakes much easier later. If your cake layers have domed tops, trim those off first so that every cake layer is level. Flat layers make a much sturdier tier cake. At the end of this step, you should have your bottom tier assembled on the cake drum, and each upper tier assembled on its own invisible cake board. Now chill all of the cakes in the fridge or freezer for 15 to 30 minutes. Eventually, instead of 3 separate cakes, you'll stack these to go from this to this. But there are a few steps first so that the upper tiers don't sink down into the tiers underneath. If you skip these next steps and just stack your cakes as they are, this is what can happen. Once the cakes are chilled, it's time to frost them, starting with a crumb coat. This is a very thin layer of buttercream that traps any crumbs coming off the cake, so they don't end up mixed into your final coat of frosting. It's much easier to frost cakes when they're cold because they're less crumbly and less wobbly, so they won't slide around or start to lean as you spread and smooth the frosting. Here's a quick peek at what happens when you don't chill a cake before frosting. Millions of crumbs come off, the cake won't stay still, and the cake layers shift so the cake starts to lean. Nightmare. For the upper tiers on their invisible cake boards, place each cake onto a larger cake board underneath. That larger cake board gives your cake scraper somewhere to rest when you smooth the frosting. To stop the cake sliding around, use tape or a non-slip mat, like this drawer liner, between the boards. Smaller cakes are especially lightweight, so they tend to move around more while you frost them. So while you're spreading the buttercream, you might need to gently hold the cake in place. But once you move on to smoothing with a cake scraper, there's much less pressure against the cake, so it's more likely to stay still. Larger cakes, like this tall 6-inch tier, are heavier, so combined with the non-slip mat or the tape underneath the cake board, their weight helps keep them stable while you spread and scrape the frosting. This crumb coat doesn't need to look neat or smooth, it just needs to completely cover the cake so that no cake is exposed. What you do want to pay attention to is any buttercream sticking up above the top edge of the cake or bulging out around the sides. Those bumps will show through your final coat of frosting later, so smooth those down now. The crumb coat always looks slightly alarming before the final coat goes on, but don't worry because this is all going to be covered up soon. Once all of the cakes are crumb coated, chill them again in the fridge or freezer for 15 to 30 minutes to set the frosting before adding your final coat. When this crumb coat is cold and firm, that's also the best time to trim any invisible cake boards if needed, because you won't damage the frosting if you do it now. Next, cover each cake with a final coat of frosting. For this cake, I'm adding texture using a textured cake comb. The easiest way to level the top edge of a cake is to use your offset spatula or straight-edged cake comb to swipe sideways across the top edge, which is what I'm doing here. But for tiered cakes, I actually prefer another method that creates really sharp top edges. which instantly make the cake look much more professional. I'll show you that technique in a second. For now, pop the cakes back into the fridge and let me show you 3 tricks for really smooth frosting. The first trick is to perfect the consistency of your buttercream. When you stir it, if you see lots of holes or air bubbles like this, and if it feels stiff and difficult to stir, it's too thick. Stiff buttercream is much harder to spread smoothly onto a cake. To fix it, scoop out about 1/3 of the buttercream and microwave it for 10 seconds. Then pour it back into the main bowl and stir everything together. That melts out the air bubbles and the transformation is really dramatic. Now the texture is smooth and creamy buttercream that's much easier to stir and to use for frosting a cake. Look at the difference between this cake, I've used the microwave hack for this buttercream so it's silky smooth, and this cake which I frosted before using the microwave hack. Look at all those little air pockets in the frosting. The next trick is for fixing tiny shallow imperfections and air bubbles after frosting the cake. Warm up your cake comb using a hairdryer, a blowtorch, or hot water. You want the comb to be warm, not hot. Now scrape around the cake and the warmth will smooth out those little imperfections, leaving really smooth frosting behind. This next trick is for getting extra sharp top edges. Put the cake into the fridge for 30 minutes or the freezer for 15 minutes. To check if your cake is ready, gently poke the top edge. If it holds its shape, the frosting is firm enough for the next step. If you can feel the buttercream give way underneath your finger, and if sticky buttercream comes off on your finger, the cake needs more chilling time. Once the frosting is firm, dip a knife into warm water and dry the knife off before slicing around the top edge of the cake. Cut away all of the buttercream sticking up above the top edge, dipping the knife back into the warm water between cuts to keep it warm and clean. This creates really sharp top edges that make tiered cakes look so professional. Look at the difference between this cake, where I used my offset spatula to swipe the top edge to level it, and this cake where I used the knife method. Okay, now for the fun part, or what most people think is the most intimidating part. It's time to stack the cake. I'm using boba straws, or wooden or plastic dowels work, but they're trickier to cut to size. These act as support pillars inside the bottom cakes. You don't need any in your top tier. Use 4 supports within each lower tier. This hidden support structure is what turns separate cakes into one stable tier cake. All of your cakes should be cold for this step, so chill them in the fridge for about an hour beforehand. Start with your bottom tier on its cake drum. Take the cake pan for the next tier up and lightly score around it onto the frosting so that you mark where the next cake is going to sit. Now push a boba straw or dowel about an inch inside that scored ring, pushing it all the way down until you feel it hit the cake board underneath the cake. Pinch the straw right where it sticks up above the frosting, pull it back out, and cut where you pinched it. That gives you the exact height you need, so the support will sit perfectly level with the cake. Use that first straw as a guide to cut 3 more straws or dowels to exactly the same height. Now push all 4 supports into the cake, pushing them about an inch inside the scored ring. Spread a little buttercream over the tops of the straws. That acts like glue and helps secure the next tier. Now take your next cake out of the fridge. Slide your offset spatula underneath the cake, between the invisible cake board and the larger cake board underneath it, and peel away the non-slip mat or tape. Carefully lower the cake down onto the bottom tier, centering it within the ring you marked earlier. Everyone holds their breath for this part until you've done it a few times and realize that cold cakes are not as fragile as you fear they are, so you really can handle them like this. Repeat the same process for the next tier. Use the cake pan that you baked the top tier in to score around the cake so you know exactly where the next tier will sit. Push a straw or dowel into the cake about an inch inside that line, all the way down to the cake board underneath. Pinch it where it sticks up above the frosting, and cut it to that exact height. As long as all of the straws are exactly the same height, the next cake will sit level on top of them. So use your first support as your guide to cut 3 more supports the same height, and then push all 4 into the cake in a square formation, about an inch inside the line you scored. Spread a little buttercream over the supports and then take your top tier out of the fridge. Separate it from the larger cake board and then lift it up and carefully lower it down onto the tier below, keeping it centered. The top tier will be sitting on its invisible cake board, which is now completely hidden inside the stacked cake. Now, 2 tips to make your tiered cake look even more professional. The first is to get rid of these seams left behind where you swiped your cake scraper or textured cake comb away from the cake. You could position these so that they're all at the back of the cake, or to smooth them out, place a piece of parchment paper or wax paper over the seam and gently press through the paper with your finger. That blends the texture together without damaging the frosting, so the seam goes from this to this. These tiny finishing details are what make cakes look perfect. Before adding any final details or decorations, it's best to chill the cake so that the frosting becomes really firm. You might need to take a shelf or two from your fridge to make space for the height of the cake. And then chill it for about 30 minutes. To cover the joins between the tiers, I like to pipe a little border around each one. For this cake, I'm using a medium-sized round piping tip, a Wilton No. 8. Fill your piping bag about 2/3 full with buttercream, so it's comfortable to hold and easier to control while piping. You can also use this buttercream to fix any little imperfections in the frosting. I accidentally poked my finger into the cake over here, so I'm piping a bit of buttercream over the mark, and then gently scraping over it with my textured cake comb to blend it in and make it disappear. The frosting on the cake being chilled makes it much more forgiving for touch-ups like this. This is a beaded border, and here are my tricks for making it neat. Rest the piping tip down on the cake board as you pipe the border. That helps steady the piping bag and also makes sure the border goes all the way down to the bottom of the cake without leaving a gap. Piping becomes much easier once you stop trying to hold the bag floating, suspended steadily in mid-air. Instead of piping each bead with the piping tip facing the cake and then pulling away, which leaves a peak on each bead, pipe sideways instead. Squeeze the piping bag to let the buttercream bulge out into a ball shape, then release your pressure as you swipe the bag away sideways, leaving a little tail on each bead. The next bead overlaps that tail. For the upper tiers, you can also rest the piping tip down on the cake below while you pipe. That steadies the piping bag, and because the cake has been chilled, the frosting is firm enough that resting the piping tip against it won't damage the frosting. This is such a quick but pretty border for any cake, but I especially love it for elegant tiered cakes because it adds detail without distracting from the rest of the design. But for more whimsical cakes, colourful, textured, and more elaborate piping can look fantastic. It's safest to transport tier cakes while they're cold because the cake and frosting are firm and much more stable. A tier cake shouldn't just look stable, it should actually survive the car ride too. Being cold helps the cake resist vibrations while you drive, as well as any sudden braking or sharp turns. This is a cake I drove 4 hours on very bumpy roads to Yosemite, and with its internal support structure and being chilled before driving, it arrived perfectly. But if you leave a cake uncovered in the fridge overnight, it can absorb flavors from the fridge, and the moisture inside the fridge can also cause condensation on the frosting. So to protect the cake, box it up now. Here's a quick hack if your cake box isn't tall enough for your cake. For the lid, use a second box, flipped upside down, and cut 2 diagonal slits into one side. Then repeat on the opposite side. Now push the middle flap inside the box, while leaving the outer flaps on the outside. That raises the height. Tier cakes can look incredibly complicated, but once you understand the structure behind them, they become so much more manageable. Tell me in the comments if you're going to use these tips and tricks, join my channel for exclusive videos, my perfectly smooth frosting course, and lots more perks. And visit my cake school on BritishGirlBakes.com to learn hundreds more cake decorating designs and techniques. See you there!